Hello and welcome. It is episode number 48 of the Hilarious Humanitarians Podcast, where we're going to be talking about suicide. September is Suicide Prevention Month, so we thought it would be really important to revisit a topic that needs to stay front and center in today's discussions on mental health. Last time we did this, we was following the suicide deaths of Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, but today we do have a return guest whose life has been forever changed by suicide in the family. My name is Frances Echeverria, licensed marriage and family therapist.
My name is Deanna Silverman, licensed clinical social worker.
We'll introduce our guest in just a second, but to give you kind of a roadmap of today's episode, we're going to be providing you with some information to share and use yourself if you or yourself are struggling with thoughts of self-harm and suicide. It's especially important to note on today's podcast, we are for informational purposes only, do not constitute medical advice, and we are not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Also, before we start, if you haven't done so already, please find us, subscribe, and rate the podcast. So, as we mentioned, we do have a guest here today. We'll introduce to you Natalie. She's from Instagram. Natalie, what is your handle on Instagram again?
It's Mommy Needs a Coffee.
Okay. Now, we're first of all, thank you very much for joining us today, because we do know this is going to be a sensitive subject, and we were trying to find somebody who had some experience to be able to kind of come on and lead this discussion. So I guess the best way to jump in is to tell us how your life has been touched by suicide.
So I was 11 years old, and my brother is 7 years older than me. He was just like this bigger than life personality, really funny and full of life, and everybody loved him. He was hilarious and athletic and good at everything that he did. He got into a serious relationship with a girl fresh out of high school, and she got pregnant. It was a big shock, obviously, them only being 18 at the time. But, once the shock wore off, everybody was excited and happy, and everybody's looking forward to the baby. And of course, they had the support of their families, behind them. When she went to the hospital to have the baby, she actually had a stillbirth. Mm-hmm. And my brother had always battled mental health, issues. He was clinically depressed and was on and off medication throughout his life. I think that life-altering tragedy for them losing a child at the age of 18, them being children themselves, I think for him, it really was the catalyst that changed his chemistry in his brain, even more so, just being traumatized by losing a child. And after we had the funeral and all of those things for the baby, my brother decided that he was going to go camping alone, which wasn't unusual. He was an outdoorsman and had gone camping, and we had a deer lease at the time.
You guys were living in Texas. You're from Texas.
Yes.
And so this is a part of your family. Like, you guys just camp and you're outdoorsy, and
yeah.
It wasn't anything particularly out of the ordinary?
No, not at all. I mean, it was a couple of months, I guess. I was only 11 years old, so The timeline of it all is still I'm not 100%, but I do know what happened was he left to go camping, and where we thought he was, because after about a week, we knew he was supposed to come home and he didn't. And we had search parties, of course, go to the deer lease and look for him and search the property, and he was missing. And he was missing for a while. I mean, I think it was like upwards of 2 months, probably.
Oh my God.
the farmer on the adjacent property who had a very large piece of property. So it's not like he drives it every single day, but he did come upon a campsite, which was just adjacent from our property line. And he found my brother, which he had looked like he had been camping. Like he took enough stuff out there to camp for about a week or so, even more, food and everything. But they don't think that by his autopsy and those kinds of things that he probably didn't live past the first night out there. Mm-hmm. So being young, I was in 6th grade, and I was told I was spending the night with a friend, and I was told that I needed to come home from a sleepover, which my parents would never do. They would, let me stay with my friends. So I knew it was bad news. And I remember driving up to my house and seeing cars, probably 10, 15 cars in my driveway. And we had death in the family before, so I knew it wasn't good. And whenever I walked in the door, the place kind of fell silent. And I already knew in my heart what was going on. And I went into my mother's room and I sat down on the bed, and my mom told me that they found my brother. And I asked if he was okay, and she said no. Of course, for her, that was kind of the end. She couldn't muster up anything else really at that point, just being in pure shock and trauma. And so my aunt stepped in and was able to really convey what had gone on, but they weren't 100% honest with me. And yeah, 11 is young. And of course, now having kids, I understand that they wanted to protect my heart. But I was essentially told that it was an accident, a hunting accident, and, that they had found him. But what the truth was is that he just couldn't see past tomorrow. He could never, he was being so young, 18 years old, he could never really see past the hurt and the loss and the tragedy of his son's death. And I think with the history of him already having all of these other mental health issues, he didn't want to bother the world anymore. And I don't think he could bear the pain either. I mean, at 18, how do you have the coping mechanisms to deal with the loss of a child? I mean, I'm 35 and I don't know how that's possible. I've seen it be a possibility because my mother is a testament, to that. But, I wasn't until I was probably 15 or 16 that I was told the truth about my brother. And I feel like a lot of that was shame, that my mother felt, or guilt, maybe from society and the stigma against suicide, and like how selfish they could be to take their own life, and those comments that people make out of pure ignorance, because people have no grasp. Some people have no grasp on what that darkness is and how they just can't even bear to pull through. It doesn't matter what you think about somebody. I mean, my brother was just so full of life, and his life was only beginning. And you would never pick him to be the person that has a mental illness or anything like that. And there was no ask for help. There was no notes or anything like that. So there was no reaching out. He had made up his mind what he was going to do, and he did it. And it was, for me now, looking back on it, I think that he was trying to do everyone else a favor. You know, he just thought that nobody cared, or nobody, I don't know if he thought that nobody cared now that I say it out loud. I think that he just was in such a dark place that he didn't think that his life mattered.
So you're 35 now, we're like 14 years later. How does the conversation go? Is there one in the family about the loss of your brother? Because I feel like people will remember people who died of any other cause, but like you said, the stigma that's wrapped up in death by suicide, it's this taboo subject.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk about him daily. I mean, my kids know who he is. They talk about him, and you know, my kids are both boys, and my brother was such a boy, like in every aspect, like sports, and just like he was so gross, and his feet stunk so bad. And like, I just remember like when he would take off his shoes, just utter wanting to throw up, and just, it was so gross. And so we joke, you know, in the house, like when my son Parker takes off his shoes, it smells like Randy, and it's just awful. And so, you know, we talk about those things, and like my brother burping the alphabet and things like that. And my sons just like love that. Now the conversation with them as far as why he's not on this earth isn't because he shot himself and, you know, he's gone yet, but it will be.
Yeah.
You know, right now I do say that, you know, it was a gun that killed my brother, and that's kind of where we leave it. And they've yet to really push any further questions so far.
Yeah.
But I will be telling them the truth. I will be sharing that with them when I feel like they can grasp the concept of it being because he was sick, not because he hated life.
I think that's so important. And I like how you talk about like you sharing good memories of him every day. Like, we've talked about this in past episodes, but Natalie's my like real life best friend. And we've been best friends since high school. And even, I mean, your boys look so much like you and your husband, but I've seen pictures of your brother and they look so much like him as well. And so it's just so, I don't know what the right word is. I mean, we've all suffered tremendous loss, and it's just, now all three of us have our own children, and we find ways to cope and remain positive and try to just keep our loved one's memory alive, you know? And it's just so, I think that through the darkness, we're doing our best to just continue to face the light, not to sound corny, and bringing our children in to appropriately have conversations, whether it's just keeping memories alive or one day when they're age appropriate to have deeper discussions, so that the stigma of mental health and suicide, we can just abolish it, because it's the shame, and it's essentially the shame and not talking about it that just makes it that much worse and isolating. So yeah, I commend you for doing everything you're doing. I think it's interesting too in talking about this, because like I said, we've been best friends now for over a decade. And it feels like yesterday. Natalie and I were talking about this earlier, like, all have our own experiences with loss. Some of us are more fortunate than others, and we don't experience loss well into our adult life. But like when I was a teenager, I had yet to experience like any, like, I want to say like first degree loss, you know, like I had heard of like older adults in my family who had passed, but I was never close to them. And so when you and I met, I can't remember when you told me about your brother, but I remember feeling, I just was so young and I didn't know how to talk about it. And I didn't even feel comfortable really talking to you about it. I mean, I'm almost kind of embarrassed to admit this because you and I are both 35 years old, and it wasn't until like, I feel like this last year that we've really talked about your brother openly, like what happened. I just never felt, I don't know what it was. It wasn't that I didn't want to acknowledge it. If anything, it was that whole level of like protection. Like, I don't want to bring up something that is possibly uncomfortable, even though I knew better, and it's like, it's just interesting how
trying to protect your friend's feelings, because revisiting those memories for anybody is hard. And especially when you know the person on a deep level like you and I do, it's you don't want to bring up the hurt, I mean, you've always been there, always been there for me when I've needed it the most.
Yeah. It's just, this is the one thing that, you're just kind of like, or at least I am. I often will think about like, why didn't I have that discussion with you? Or way
because
earlier.
We were young.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But it's good. I think it's a good point to bring up because I know that we have younger listeners, or even people who are 35 who are going, God, I like, it's like in the pit of your stomach or in your heart where you're like, I want to say something. I don't know how to say it. And I think a good starting point is just asking about who the person was. Like, I want to learn about who he was and like once again, kind of keeping the memory alive and sharing those good memories. Of course, sometimes people will not feel comfortable, but I think for the most part, in my experience, like, because in my professional life, I had to have these tough conversations daily. And in my experience, people are open to it when approached respectfully. And you were open to it, when we sat down and talked about your brother in depth.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people have a hard time talking about anything hurtful or sad, or especially when it comes to suicide, I feel like they're afraid of hurting my feelings.
Right.
Especially people that don't know me. Like I found something that I posted on Instagram, and it was from a guy named Matt Haig, and he wrote, "Male suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50. It is preventable. Let's not man up. Let's not tough it out. Let's find true strength instead. Let's show our vulnerability. Let's stop faking macho bullshit. Let's change." And it was actually posted by somebody else who has an account that's trying to like redefine masculinity, I think, and just kind of change the way we think about masculinity. And he said, boys stop talking about their emotions at about 14 and 15 years old. That's the same age boys start suicide at 5 times the rate of girls. This rejection of emotions is one of the reasons men are more addicted to drugs or alcohol and commit about 90% of all violent crime. You're human. Your emotions are human emotions. Redefine masculinity. And that was by Eric McGriff.
Mm-hmm.
I had never really opened up about my family's loss on that large of a platform. I had done some suicide prevention in high school and with the Yellow Ribbon Foundation. And I never really opened up about my family's loss on a large platform like my social media. And I don't know what it was, but I read that and I just like felt like I need to make this aware for more people, and so I posted it, and I was so taken back by how many direct messages I got, how many people in the comments section saying their stories, and just creating a safe place for people to come together and really talk about, the sadness that comes along with it and how life-changing and life-altering it really is. I mean, it is hard to survive when you feel it is so bleak,
Mm-hmm.
And I mean survival in the sense that like you still have to go to work, or for me it was I still had to go to school, and just dealing with those such large emotions and being able to cope and do life at the same time.
Yeah.
It's tough. And I feel like a lot of people don't want to bring that up, because they're afraid that they're going to hurt your feelings, or that you're going to have to talk about it and then you're going to get upset.
Right.
Did they provide you with any sort of support when it happened or later? I know you said there was about a 4-year, 5-year gap between your brother's death and then explaining it. I guess I'm just wondering, in those years where you're processing, the grief that's associated with his loss, were there any, counselors, support groups, anything? Nothing?
All of the above.
All of the above. Okay.
Yes. I was I had my own therapist. We had family therapy, and it was weekly. We're Christian and at the time we lived in a small town. So our church family really came together, and just to support my mom, because she was in such a dark place, and me, and me,
right.
Of course. Our whole family was really lifted up by the community, which was nice. But I know that not everybody grows up in a small town and has the benefits of a church family or any family. Some people go through this alone and with no resources as far as therapy, and that's hard. I can't imagine not having therapy during that time, to be able to learn how to cope and have the skills to work through the grief, because it was, the grief is such a weird thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many different stages, and as a child, I processed it the only way I could, but I needed resources, and everybody that is going through it needs resources.
Right. And we're going to be sharing some of those at the end of this podcast at one particular website so that people can go there based on age breakdowns and things of that nature. What I wanted to ask you both, if you're all right with answering the question, is sometimes people don't understand that suicide ideation is actually pretty common. When we talk about that, that's when people are depressed and they feel like dying. Now, that doesn't mean they're making plans or writing notes or even attempting. But I think sometimes people have a hard time understanding how you can get to that dark place when you're dealing with like loss or depression. If you don't mind answering, either one of you, have you found yourself in a situation where you have had suicide ideation?
I haven't, but I think that I'm lucky. I'm one of the lucky ones. I didn't want my life to end, and I wasn't sure if it was because of just loving my life and loving life in general. I know that when you have mental health, that doesn't matter. I was healthy. I was of sound mind.
Mm-hmm.
I could make rational decisions. And even though I was young, a lot of weight was put on me to kind of grow up,
Right.
a little bit at that point. And it wasn't pushed by anybody. It just happens, when you go through a tremendous loss and your parents are going through the same tremendous loss. I really had to step up and kind of get myself up for school some mornings when my mom couldn't get out of bed, or, call my aunt whenever I needed something because my mom couldn't. And I put zero blame on her for any of that.
Right.
I'm just grateful that she was able to pull through the death of a son.
Was your brother your only sibling?
No.
Okay. So
At the time, yes. I had a stepbrother, but he was my only blood.
Okay.
And then it was remarkable. My mom actually got pregnant at 40 with my sister. right after, it was like 2 years after my brother's death. And it was like a miracle because my mother was she was like rail thin, you know. She was probably 100 pounds. And she got pregnant and was like, it was something just switched. And she was like, okay, well, I have a life inside of me now. And although I was a walking life, keeping her alive, you know, I couldn't force food down her throat.
Right.
It's just amazing to me that like how suicide can affect families in so many different ways. I mean, my mom's came out as an eating disorder, and, you know, there were other like ripple effects that happen. And of course, I'm sure I had some unhealthy coping skills too as I got older, you know, but I just think that it was my sister's birth that saved my mom's life. It was the family counseling that saved all of us, you know, saved my parents' marriage as well, because 90% of people that lose a child their marriage doesn't last.
Right.
From suicide, anyway. I do know that. But I mean, I think anyway, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Deanna, what about you? We've talked a little bit when you and I were talking about the loss of like our mothers.
Yeah, I had a few dark moments. Nothing. I'm just trying. It's been a long time. I mean, I remember when I was 18. I don't think at the time I was like clinically depressed. To be honest, I think I was just like crazy hormonal. Like, and I don't mean that in like I don't want people hearing that and being like, you're being sexist or whatever. Like, I literally was just hormonal. Let's call it what it is. I mean, and my parents had a couple years before that gotten a divorce, and my mom was with a guy I did not like at all. Like, there was just like a lot of chaos. Natalie was around during that time. And I remember just having like freak out moments where it was just like, what is my purpose here? Like, and just like hysterically crying. And then my mom got diagnosed with cancer. And I wouldn't say there was a lot of ideation at that time, but certainly after she died, I had a few really dark moments where I didn't necessarily have a plan, but I remember thinking pretty impulsively that like if I had access to something, I may have made a really terrible decision. And looking back, I'm happy I didn't. But I remember specifically I had an argument with my dad that day. And my brother is, God love him, Natalie knows him well. We're just two very different people. We love each other, but I'm very much the empath and the sensitive one in my family. And
he's not.
He's the opposite.
He's just not at all. And so when I lost my mom, I lost my like biggest fan, my best friend. Natalie knew my mom so well. I mean, she was very close to my mom. And so when I lost my mom, I lost like a huge chunk of myself. I can't explain. It was just absolutely surreal. So it was already hard grappling with the fact that like my life has now dramatically changed in the way it looks and the way it feels. And then when I had an argument, a big fight with my dad, and I didn't have really any, at least at the time, I remember in the moment thinking, I don't have anybody to reach out to who really understands me, who's not going to be like sarcastic or minimize my experience or anything like that. Because my mom was really the only person that I felt like genuinely would hear me out, and also had her own struggles. Like my mom was very kind of rebellious in her own way, and I'm the same way. So like, even though I have an aunt who's like I'm very, very close to, she and I are very, very different. Like we would make completely different decisions. And so I felt like I lost my person. And so I remember that day we got into that argument, and I just thought to myself, like, I don't want to be here at all. Like I don't want to be here. I want to be where my mom is. But But in my heart, I was like, I'm not a religious person at all. And I remember thinking, I don't know. Like, I just want to be with her, but I don't know what the decision, and I don't want to hurt my family members. But there was like kind of this crossroads of thinking, God, if I had access to something, I may have made a wrong decision, which is also, this is another topic that I won't dive super into, but this is also why people in our field talk about access, like access to guns, access to medications, access to weapons that could harm us. Like, people are always talking, I don't want to turn this into a political thing, but when we talk about like, oh, gun control and whatever, like truly the access of having something in front of you when you're in that impulsive, dark place can drastically change the course of whether you're going to see tomorrow or not.
Right.
And because I didn't have anything in front of me, I was able to just scream it out and hysterically cry it out and feel really fucking shitty, but be able to see the next day and sleep it off and wake up the next day. And my dad called me to apologize, and then all was right in the world again. You know, but like in the moment, I might have made a wrong decision and never heard the apology or thought differently.
Right. And you're right. That is why in safety planning, we talk about, you know, is there access in the home? I mean, I've worked with clients to have, you know, firearms or medication removed from the home. Safety planning, especially with impulsive kids, like, you know, maybe keep an eye on them. Don't be going anywhere where there's like heavy traffic, stuff like that, because sometimes kids will, and adults too, you know, walk into traffic. And so I think it's important to just kind of have that in back of your mind if you're dealing with someone, including yourself, that's really depressed. I think too, though, the reason why I bring up the suicide ideation is that it is very common, and that just saying that you feel like dying or the world would be better without me, anything like that, is not grounds to get hauled off on a 5150. And I think sometimes people worry about that. They say like, if I worry, you know, if I say I want to die, that all of a sudden this whole, like, they come and take them away in a straitjacket. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation about that. So it's important, whether you're seeing a therapist or not, or talking to a friend, and just being really honest and asking people, like, do you feel like dying? Like, there's no easy way to do it. You just ask the question.
Yeah. There's also been other times, I shared this when I went to grief counseling and they did the initial assessment where she asked me, do you feel like dying? And I said, yes. In the moment, I was like, yeah, no, I would rather not be here. And just going back to what you just said, like, just because we're verbalizing the feeling of just, I kind of would want to be somewhere else, or being ambivalent, sometimes what we talk about, like the ambivalence of wanting to die or staying alive, that occurs all the time. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be put on a 5150. Like, I was sitting in front of a therapist telling her, if I was hit by a bus today, I would be happy about it. I don't want to kill myself, but I don't want to live. And what she ended up telling me was, your feelings are extremely normal. You just lost somebody extremely significant to you, and this is a part of grief. Sometimes people don't experience it, but many do. And I walked out of there feeling much better, and not on a 5150. I got to drive in my car and drive away. Of course, she asked me certain questions, follow-up questions, to make absolute sure that I wasn't in need of like a formal psych evaluation to determine like a need for a hold for inpatient treatment. But my point is that it felt better the minute she asked me the question, which it goes against everything that we tell ourselves, including me. Like, when I've been around friends and when I was younger, you know, and it's just going, oh, like, you don't want to ask the question. You feel like it's going to make it worse, but it doesn't.
And you're not going to put an idea in their head. I think that's the other thing, is we don't want to ask, because what if it puts look, if they're in a place where you're picking up on that vibe, they've already had the idea.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're going to push them in that direction.
I think a big thing too is that a lot of people what they don't understand is that somebody that wants to kill themselves is going to do it. I mean, unless they get help, unless somebody intervenes, unless they're able to voice that, that they're not right. They need people to ask those questions. And, this was in 1994, and there was a lot of death happening that year. There was a lot of people that died that year, like Kurt Cobain, and, so I think Brad from Sublime died shortly after that as well. And it was like, I think a lot of people had this like idea of what suicide or drug overdose or whatever it is at the time. But for us, there was no sign. Yes, we were all grieving the loss of his child. And I think that was also just, it was horrible, obviously. And we were all having to deal with the grief of that. And then on top of that, a few months later, when he was found, it was such a shock. Nobody could believe that he would take his own life, because he never ever showed a sign of that, of feeling that way. And I feel like a lot of people don't interject in someone's life when they're grieving or whatever it is. It's just, it can be prevented. It really can.
I think Natalie brings up a great point, that sometimes the people that need to be asked the most if they're doing okay are the ones we least expect. We saw this shock, actually, the last time that we did this topic for the podcast about, it was Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, and people who, appear to be okay. And I think that we need to think about asking our strong friends, asking our strong family members, and people in situations where you think like, oh, this could be really tough for anybody, because there can be that sense, I think, with people who believe they're supposed to have their act together, that they're not allowed to be scared, vulnerable, feel like dying. I mean, I don't know your brother, but obviously like he was struggling and for whatever reason didn't feel like he could talk about it.
I feel that is so true. And I feel a lot of times that maybe he thought him talking about his pain would burden everyone else, because we were all dealing with it too. I mean, yes, he lost a son, but I lost my nephew, and my mom lost her first grandchild, and his girlfriend lost, so I feel like he just felt like, I'm too much of a burden for everyone, so I'm just going to make everyone's life easier by leaving.
Yeah.
And there in turn, he altered our lives forever. I do feel like some good has come out of it. I have been able to be there for people through tremendous loss and show them that you can come out the other side and have a normal life. It's different. It's very, very different. But I do live a life that I'm happy. I'm still sad thinking about not having my brother here, of course. But we do talk about his life and what legacy he left. And that's what we celebrate.
Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up, we did mention that we wanted to provide some resources. And Deanna, you found just like a database of a ton of stuff.
Yeah. So, and it's free, all free. So honestly, everybody who's listening should download this. If you don't use it, give it to somebody who will. 'Cause I mean, it's just really a solid guideline. It's from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. You can go to afsp.org. I'm just going to run through the table of contents real quick, just so you could hear what type of resources they have. They talk about helping young loss survivors, taking care of yourself, understanding suicide. It talks about how to navigate the immediate aftermath, how to inform young people of a suicide death. It even goes into talking about like age recommendations. So if you're talking to a preschooler age 3 to 5 years old, if you're talking to an early elementary schooler 6 to 8 years old, so on and so forth. It goes into like teens and early adulthood, how to specifically talk to them about the loss of a loved one in an age appropriate way, as to not traumatize them. And it talks about avoiding using graphic details. Like the graphic details are not relevant, but talking openly and honestly about the death of the loved one is really imperative to how somebody is going to eventually heal and really understand the loss and what it means and how we can move forward, celebrate the loss of our loved one's life. It talks about there's resources of understanding suicide grief in children and teens. So if you're a parent and you're wondering, how is my child going to grieve? What are the things that I need to say? What are symptoms I need to look out for? That's a really wonderful resource. It even talks about like how to maintain an open dialogue, dealing with reminders of loss. We talk a lot about like anticipatory grief, or like anticipating the anniversary of the death, anniversary of their birthday, Christmas, holidays can be really rough. So this is a great resource to understand how we're going to deal with those things. It also talks about managing the return to school. There's a whole section of focusing on teens, and then it goes into additional resources for child, teen, adult survivors. There's even a guide for schools to use. There's all sorts of websites. We're going to post them on our Instagram page, but it also, just to wrap up, it even goes into general loss. So it doesn't necessarily have to be suicide loss, but just, general loss, talking about death. Because I, for one, can say my family could have really used that, like generationally, like could have used it. With me talking to my dad, like my dad's dad died when he was 3 and he was lied to, and didn't talk about it. I actually called my dad today and I was like, I just want to make sure that I got this story straight. Like, were you lied to? And he goes, I wasn't necessarily lied to. It wasn't talked about. And I'm like, well, when eventually did they talk to you about your dad dying? And he's like, well, I remember when I was like 6 or 7, we moved in with my stepdad. I'm like, so you just moved in with your stepdad and there was no conversation about your dad? And he's like, no. I'm like, I'm not trying to like laugh about the situation, but it's just so like, what? And then his stepdad ended up killing himself, actually. And I even asked him about that. Like, was there a conversation about that? And he's like, no, not really. And so how does that spill over into how he raised me and my brother, and same thing with my mom. My mom never talked about it. So guess what? They didn't talk to me and my brother about death. I mean, when my mom died when I was 26 years old, I completely had a freak out. Like, I didn't want to face it or see her or anything like that when she died. So sorry to kind of ramble in talking about resources, but this guide it really speaks to me because it really helps the adults figure out how to navigate tremendous loss and tremendous grief, especially when we have our own children to protect and teach. And as much as we want to protect them from the darkness that life can bring, it's inevitable that it's going to touch them. So why not have it be from their parent who they trust and they love and they want to hear it from us, no one else,
And one thing too that I want to bring up is that children are way more resilient than we give them credit for.
Oh, yes.
As Natalie, you were 11 and you figured out how to get things together so that your mom wouldn't, you wouldn't be dependent on her when she was dealing with her grief. That's just an example. But kids can be really resilient. They can also, if you allow them to ask questions, sometimes as adults, I think we shut things down because it gets uncomfortable. If we just allow them to ask questions openly and honestly, and sometimes maybe the timing isn't that great, whatever, but to just keep that honest, open conversation going, it can be really useful. And I think we don't give kids enough credit in that way. One thing I also want to bring up in terms of resources is NAMI, NAMI.org, has a lot of information. There's the suicide hotline, which we've posted before. And I saw this one online, and Deanna, I saw you reposted it as well. But they have the first transgender suicide hotline in the United States that for the first time is going to be staffed entirely by transgender people to serve transgender people. And this is especially important to bring up because the rate of attempted suicides in trans individuals who are not accepted by their family is upwards of 40%. And it is one of the hardest things for families to recognize, for some families, in terms of trying to be supportive of their trans youth. So that, I think that's a step in the right direction in providing not just support, but support for very at-risk communities in some cases. So
I want to share that phone number because it's in the United States for the transgender suicide hotline. It's 877-565-8860. And it also is in Canada. The number is 877-330-6366. One last thing I wanted to mention, what I really liked about this guide was it's one thing to talk about the importance of talking to our kids, but a lot of us, including myself, oftentimes need the tools or the words. It's like, okay, I'm open to having this discussion, but I don't know what to say, and I don't know how to say it. And I'm scared because I don't want to get caught off guard, or I don't want to say the wrong thing. So the nice thing about these resources in this guide is that it literally gives you a script. And I know it might sound a little cold, but it's anything but. It gives you a script and you can alter it however you like, because it's really, really important. This has come up a lot, like in my past jobs and whatnot, where because we want to protect our kids, we'll say things like, I'll even hear adults use the word, like she passed away instead of saying she died. Often I'll say my mom died, and I'll see people kind of like cringe back. Like, oh my God, that was really like harsh how you just said that. And I'm like, well, she died. Like there's no, I don't know. But I mean, I was guilty of saying she passed away, and it's not that bad. I'm not beating myself over it, but I did say passed away for about a year after she died because it just felt less, I don't know. Like
it made it easier maybe for the people you were having to tell.
Yeah, I don't know. And so, but I've even heard people say things like to their kids, not even she passed away, she went to sleep and never woke up.
Yeah, no.
And so what ends up happening when you tell a child that is, guess what's going to happen naturally? They're going to be terrified of going to sleep. I've heard people say they went on vacation. They went to go visit somebody. And like, well, okay, so now, and I'm not trying to be funny about it, but really it's when we think about it, it's a little ridiculous, and we have to kind of take a step back and realize like, oh man, there's good intentions there. You're not trying to scare or harm your child, but you're kind of doing exactly that. So I encourage people to look into what it is that you can say as to not confuse or further traumatize your children or friends or whoever it is that you're talking to.
Natalie, I do want to say thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Natalie.
You can find Natalie at Mommy Needs a Coffee on Instagram. Deanna, you're all over the internet.
Oh, yes, I am. Hilarious Humanitarian on Instagram, or Humanitarian Mom if you want to see my parenting adventures. You can find our podcast Instagram at Humanitarians Podcast. And Shut Up Skippy. You can find Francis at Shut Up Skippy, right, on Snapchat, Instagram. And I love your website.
Yeah, shutupskippy.com. Some blogs up there. And I am always looking for guest bloggers too. If you'd like to go ahead and hit me up on social media for that. All right. September is National Suicide Prevention Month. We hope that this has raised some awareness for not just those suffering with thoughts of suicide, but also people who have had to experience it through the loss of family members and loved ones. Again, thank you very much, Natalie. We do appreciate it. And we will be back next week. Bye.
Bye, guys. Bye.